Welcome. On July 14th, 1789, a crowd stormed the Bastille, a royal fortress and prison in Paris, freeing its prisoners and stealing its weapons. In and of itself, this hardly seems worthy of note. The prison was mostly empty and held only 7 prisoners. Some weapons were stolen, but they too were few. And yet, for many then, this was a startling event. In fact, still today, the French celebrate July 14th as Bastille Day, which they also call La Fête Nationale, that is, the national feast or national celebration. But the storming of the Bastille can helpfully be used to point to something else, how the French Revolution was not simply about the rhetoric of liberté, égalité, fraternité. Rather, the French Revolution also involved lawlessness and violence. And, in fact, as it continued, the lawlessness and violence moved center stage. It also turned international, as the succession of revolutionary governments justified ambitions for expansion in the name of freedom, embroiling much of Europe in war. Today, we'll look at how the French Revolution turned against both the monarchy and long-standing European allies, before descending into literal terrorism, the suspension of habeas corpus, and ultimately the murder of tens of thousands of citizens, including thousands of Catholic clergy. Today, we look at how the French Revolution fractured and broke down. As the French Revolution progressed, the revolutionary governments changed. In the process, they became more radical. The first such change occurred in July of 1789, when the National Assembly became the National Constituent Assembly. Beginning in late 1789, the National Constituent Assembly passed a series of laws that aimed to remake the Catholic Church in France. But because more than 90% of France's population was Catholic, imposing religious changes was bound to be controversial. On November 2nd, 1789, the church's property was nationalized. On February 13th, 1790, monastic vows were forbidden, and on July 12th, 1790, the National Constituent Assembly passed the Civil Constitution of the Clergy. Now, for the first time, clerical offices in the church were made matters for popular election. The Catholic Church thus lost its autonomy and became a branch of the state. But there was a problem here. The civil constitution of the clergy forced citizens to choose between, on the one hand, the old church, defined in part through allegiance with the Pope, and, on the other hand, what seemed to many a new church. Many bishops spoke against the civil constitution, and so did clergy. The king was not a fan, and was rumored to have aligned himself with clergy loyal to the old church. So the National Assembly required clergy to take an oath of loyalty to the revolution, or else they would lose their jobs. Some clergy took the oath, others refused, and the nation divided. It's no exaggeration to say the civil constitution of the clergy was probably the most fatal decision made by the revolutionaries. On September 30th, 1791, the National Constituent Assembly dissolved itself. It handed the reins to a new revolutionary body, the Legislative Assembly, which began the following day on October 1st. The Legislative Assembly inherited a fraught political environment, defined at least in part by growing mistrust in the king, at least among revolutionaries, especially in Paris. Several months earlier, on June 20th, the king and royal family had fled Paris. They hoped to escape to Belgium, but they were caught and forcibly returned to the capital. And thus began one of the great legacies of the French Revolution. The National Constituent Assembly divided both ideologically and spatially. Those who sat on the left began arguing that the king was a traitor to the nation and should therefore be executed. Those who sat on the right argued instead that the king should be absolved of any wrongdoing. The Legislative Assembly then voted to suspend the monarchy. And when the Legislative Assembly was replaced by the National Convention, the first act of the new revolutionary government was the complete abolition of the monarchy. So, in 1792, the French Revolution embarked on a new direction. Louis XVI was then executed, January 21st, 1793. Here is one of many pictures of the king's beheading. Entitled The Tragic End of Louis XVI, it contains some of his final words, namely a denial of any wrongdoing, a stated desire for the happiness of his people, and finally, a request that heaven would pardon those who murdered him. His wife, the Queen Marie Antoinette, was soon executed as well, and their son, Louis XVII, later died in prison. It's probably safe to say that, at least in the United States, Marie Antoinette is the best known of the French Revolution's royal victims. Even if people don't know anything about her, they know of her. But the same cannot be said of either Louis XVI or Louis XVII. And yet, much of what people know about Marie Antoinette is not history, but at best folklore. It was originally propaganda, often of a pornographic nature. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen had pushed for freedom of the press, but one side effect of this was the growth of pornographic literature in France. As the revolution wore on, becoming more radical and ultimately anti-monarchical, Marie Antoinette not only became a popular subject in this literature, but also a scapegoat for the revolution's own struggles. She was not French by birth, but Austrian. The growth of anti-Austrian sentiment in France eventually intertwined with the revolutionary government's declaration of war on Austria in 1792. Marie Antoinette was portrayed in pornographic pamphlets as highly promiscuous, engaging in orgies, as fathering her son, Louis XVII, illegitimately, and even as committing incest with him. Perhaps remarkably, these lurid stories had an impact upon Marie Antoinette's own accusers in the revolutionary government. They asked her, during her trial, whether she had, in fact, committed such acts, accusations that she denied, and in this she was probably truthful. In 2006, the world was subjected to the horrid film Marie Antoinette. Although not pornographic, it was rooted in some of the same myths created by France's revolutionaries, with Marie Antoinette having an affair. To quote the historian Chantal Thomas, in her book The Wicked Queen, The Origins of the Myth of Marie Antoinette, "Myth has a life of its own. It is independent of support. The latter may die the physical death of the body, but the myth still hovers over the cadaver." And when it comes to Marie Antoinette, this remains true still today. The beheading of the king had an unintended consequence. It secured opposition to the revolution, especially among those who longed for the restoration of traditional Catholicism. Civil war broke out, with the National Convention still at the helm of government, confronted by a new armed force calling itself the Catholic and Royal Army. But opposition was not just local, it was also international, and multiple European nations banded together to oppose the revolution. The National Convention responded by conscripting hundreds of thousands of young men into its revolutionary army. In a bid at restoring order, the National Convention then engaged in a widespread policy of mass arrests and execution. It also vested authority in a 25-member group called, perhaps ironically, the Committee of Public Safety. Vested with emergency powers, the committee proved autocratic, authoritarian, and arbitrary, far worse than anything ever done by King Louis XVI or any of his predecessors. Thus began what has become perhaps the most infamous episode in the French Revolution, the Terror. Within months, more than 14,000 were arrested and executed. Catholic clergy who opposed the civil constitution of the clergy were especially targeted. The precise total who ultimately died is a matter of some debate, but may be as high as 40,000, all within the space of less than a year. Because Catholicism was so important to those who opposed the revolution, during the Terror, the National Convention struck at the heart of Catholic belief and practice by closing down Catholic churches. The National Convention also introduced a new calendar. They looked back upon 1792, when the monarchy was abolished, and hailed it as year one of liberty. That is, the first year, not of the French monarchy, but of the French Republic. They even retitled the months and reorganized them to avoid overlap with the traditional calendar. Connections to France's Christian past, specifically its Catholic past, were thus rapidly removed. Holy days such as Christmas were gotten rid of and replaced with quasi-religious celebrations of the Revolution. Today, all of this is generally called De-Christianization, but at the time it was called De-Baptisation. Nonetheless, one could fairly argue that, for the revolutionary government, the French Revolution had become a new religion, one intended to replace the old. France was now a republic, with a new calendar and a new set of religious practices, and all of this was held together with terror. But the terror failed. Its leaders were executed with the guillotine, the very same method of execution used against the king, Marie Antoinette, and the victims of the terror. What remained of the National Convention ratified a new constitution, one with a bicameral legislature and an executive branch headed by a 5-member committee. Thus began the period known as the Directory. It was determined to avoid the excesses and horrors of the recent past, but also determined to prevent the restoration of the monarchy. Churches reopened, although church and state remained separate. But the Directory inherited more than a badly divided nation. Just weeks before the new government came into being, the economy collapsed. In portions of France, a new barter economy rapidly emerged. Cash was worthless, coin was often refused because of suspicion about its authenticity, but grain was acceptable, both as legal tender and as vital for survival itself. But not all were happy. Radical ideas did not disappear, and perhaps no one was more radical than Gracchus Babeuf, a journalist who headed a political movement known as the Equals. He denounced the Directory, called for the abolition of private property, and led a failed revolt in the name of the people, calling for liberty, equality, and common happiness. Arrested, tried, and executed, he nonetheless proved an inspiration to those who, in the 19th century, would be known as communists. But he was hardly the Directory's only enemy. The Directory had never halted the wars of its predecessors, and international opposition not only continued but intensified. Unstable and attacked within and without, the Directory collapsed in 1799, as a coup brought yet another government into being, that of Napoleon Bonaparte. So what? So when did the French Revolution end? In particular, was Napoleon's dictatorship part of the revolution's history, or did it reject the revolution? There are clearly points of overlap. For example, Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, who authored What is the Third Estate, helped bring Napoleon to power. And, recognizing the religious fault lines created by previous revolutionary governments, one of his first acts was rapprochement with the Catholic Church. He granted toleration to both Catholic groups, those aligned with the revolution and those aligned with the Pope. But Napoleon also had his own imperial ambitions. Crowning himself emperor in 1800, he sought to recreate France and then Europe in his own image. His goal was to unify Europe by force when and where necessary. The ensuing conflicts have been called Europe's first total war. One result was the demise in 1806 of the millennium-old Holy Roman Empire. The 19th and 20th centuries would see wave upon wave of German nationalism look back and try to recreate some version of the Holy Reich. To make a very long story short, in 1815, Napoleon was finally defeated at Waterloo, and he died in 1821. But by this point, the French monarchy had been restored. Louis XVIII, brother of Louis XVI, was welcomed back to France in 1814. He accepted a written constitution, and thus some of the early demands of the French Revolution. But by 1814, the Revolution was 25 years old, and perhaps unsurprisingly, King Louis XVIII was also known as King Louis the Desired. But this and its subsequent history is ultimately another topic for another day. If you're interested in learning more, these books are worth consulting. First, for a thorough analysis of religion, whether as identity, as points of contention, or as point of pride, read Religion and Revolution in France, 1780 to 1804 by Nigel Aston. Next, an engaging overview of Marie Antoinette, especially the propaganda against her, can be found in The Wicked Queen, The Origins of the Myth of Marie Antoinette by Chantal Thomas. It contains full translations of multiple works of propaganda, including those that were both politically motivated and pornographic. Finally, Napoleon by David A. Bell offers a short but insightful read on Napoleon Bonaparte in both history and legend. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button, feel free to leave a comment, and I'll see you next time.